Good morning, everyone. It's time for us to begin our study today. We are continuing after the last week's introduction, and because of the tardiness of the material getting here, I prepared a lot of external material that with regard to the history leading up to the events of the book of Daniel. But we'll be giving more attention to the questions in the workbook as we go forward as a way to try to guide our study. And now that everyone's had a chance to get the material and had a full week to be able to prepare and such, we'll be following along using the workbook as our guide during the majority of our lessons, and not have so much unscripted material presented and as part of our lesson. We're continuing today. This is the second lesson is in the second chapter of the book of Daniel. After going through our introduction and establishing the setting in Babylonia, in the capital city, we began moving right into the narrative. And as noted last week, the narrative shifts here in language in these middle chapters. The first chapter of the book of Daniel is in Hebrew, and it's meaningful, especially meaningful to a Hebrew audience, is the connection to God and the laws that God gave to his people that made them distinct, particularly the dietary rules, and even how Daniel and his friends would fare as captives as being displaced from Judea into Babylon. But then in the second chapter, we shift into a language called Aramaic. And Aramaic is an old language, and it was spoken even in Jesus' time. Matter of fact, that this is one of the things, other than the oddities of this particular book, and a demonstration, I think, of the intended audience. The intended audience would be to, of course, the Israelites, or the Judeans, rather, that had been taken captive in Babylon, but also to the surrounding nations. That as they were puzzling about why the people who were rumored to be God's people were suffering the fate that they suffered, this would help provide some explanation of that, particularly how God works in the kingdom of men. And so that's just a distinction about this particular Old Testament book that I think it's worth pointing out as we see a shift away from Daniel and his companions specifically into what's going on in the court, what's going on in the king's court inside of Babylon. With that as an introduction, we'll pause for a word of prayer and then we'll begin our study. Will you bow, please? Our Father in heaven, we're again thankful for each way that you're mindful of us, but especially for this period of time that we can consider things from your word. We pray that the time we spend will be useful, that it will prepare us to render service to you and give glory to you as we uncover the facts, the things that you've recorded for us in your word, so that we can better understand about you and your purpose, as well as what your expectations would be of us. Bless us in this effort, Father, and we pray that we will get from the word what you intended for us too. Go with us now, forgive us of our sins. In the end, please give us a home in heaven with you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So, with the beginning of this particular narrative, what happens in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign? Has a dream. What's the effect that this dream has on Nebuchadnezzar?
He can't sleep.
Can't sleep. He's troubled by it, I think, as his spirit is troubled and sleep left him. Don't exactly, in verse 32, it describes this image that he sees, this statue, as terrible, but it doesn't really seem so bad. But perhaps the troubling aspect, the fact that this dream repeats, and it is keeping him awake. Whenever, if you go to sleep, sometimes, I don't know if you experience this, but sometimes when you're awakened in the night, you turn it over, hear a sound or something, and you go back to sleep, you kind of pick up where you left off. And maybe that was the aspect, the fact that this dream just kept reoccurring to him, that he couldn't dream of anything else. And it's this image, he didn't understand what the dream was, that there was an imperative maybe to understand it because it was a repeating dream.
Or maybe God made it so that it troubled him.
Maybe so. Maybe.
To us it just seems simple, but to him, maybe God put the fear in him. Maybe
a giant statue made of different kind of metals was particularly terrifying to Nebuchadnezzar. The scriptures don't really say that. So we are whatever. If you've ever seen artist renditions of these, they don't make them that the figure is in attack mode or something like that. It's just a big statue to us anyway. But to Nebuchadnezzar, it was greatly troubling. And so what's Nebuchadnezzar's challenge to his assembly of magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and Chaldeans. I guess it's the ordinary wise men. What's his challenge to them? Christopher?
He wanted some interpretations.
Okay, he wants an interpretation.
Yeah, he was very strict and, told him, hey, this is what I need. If not, this is what's going to happen. And so I find it kind of unique.
Okay, how strict was he? How serious was he in getting to the bottom of this? Cindy?
I was going to say, he didn't want just an interpretation. He wanted somebody to tell him what his dream was. He didn't tell him what his dream was and then wanted it interpreted. He wanted somebody to tell the dream and the interpretation.
Exactly. I was going to loop back to that, but then again, what's the stakes? What's the consequences if the wise men are unable to fulfill this? Cynthia?
They'll be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be made of rubbish heaps.
Does it get much worse than that? I guess you could desecrate the remains, but I mean, the king is he's going to get a solution, and he's called what he thinks are the best qualified people to be able to provide that solution. But if the problem is a lot worse, as Cindy indicated, than just interpreting the dream, you've got Nebuchadnezzar demands that they tell him the dream. Yes, Jerry?
Do you think when they desecrate the houses, they get rid of the families also?
I suspect so. I don't think that the houses were just going to, go TP the house or set it on fire.
It amazes me. Some people dream color, some don't. This is definitely in color.
Yes, it is.
Gold or silver.
I don't know if there's anything significant to that, but definitely being able to distinguish materials is key to understanding the dream. But I mean, this sounds like an intractable problem. What is the counteroffer that is offered by the wizards and the wise men?
Gifts, rewards, and great honor.
Pardon?
Gifts, rewards, and great honor.
No. What's their counteroffer? He challenges them to tell the dream, to describe the dream, and to interpret it.
And we'll tell you what it means.
That's right. If you didn't, I was talking over you, so I'm sorry. But she is very. And this is pretty. This indicates some wisdom, doesn't it? I mean, they'll tell you now. Modern consultants and problem solvers will tell you that the first thing you do is restate the problem in the form that allows a solution. That's what they teach you at consultant school. Yes, Joanne, did you have a comment? Okay. So basically, they restate the offer. They say, I think we understand. We understand what you're looking for, but all you got to do is just tell us the dream, and then we'll put our wits and guile and our skills to bear to tell you what it means. What's Nebuchadnezzar's counter offer? No, he offers a reason as to why he stated the challenge in this particular way. They give a lot of flowery language here, but then in verse 8, the king answered and said, "I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, and because you see from the word from me is firm, if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You've agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the times change. And you're trying to change my mind. You're trying to negotiate this to a easier problem, and the king's not having any of it. And so the challenge remains, and what's the ultimate conclusion, the last sentence of this particular paragraph? What do the wizards and the wise men conclude? In verse 10, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's command. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asked is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. So it's kind of a passive-aggressive concession of defeat, isn't it? They basically said no one on earth can do this. Only a God can provide this kind of an answer. Only a God has this kind of power. Lynn?
But the irony is, they're the ones who are supposed to be speaking to the gods for the king.
That's exactly. Why do you think the king is saying, well, what do I have you here for?
Yeah.
That's what you guys are supposed to be providing to me. You're supposed to have these channels. You're supposed to have this kind of information, but they're conceding that this is something they cannot do. Cindy?
I kind of took that from verse 8 where he tells them that if he tells them the dream, they could just come up with something of an interpretation and it could be false. But if they could actually tell him what the dream was, then what they say is true.
Sure, and that's raising the stakes, not only for them, and raises the difficulty of it and such, but it genuinely indicates that they're in touch with the supernatural, that they aren't just coming up with something on the fly to save their skins, because after all, when they reported to the king, it was a pretty good day. But after visiting the king and hearing what he's asked, suddenly their lives and that of their families are in peril. And they're beginning to realize that here the consequences for failure are enormous. Now, this is 2 years. Yes, Tim?
I think it's interesting to see also that the way they answer the king isn't just a straight up, we can't do this. It is, you're asking something that's impossible for us to do, so it's your fault that we can't do this.
Exactly. It's kind of a passive aggressive, puts it back on the king. You know, we would provide a better answer if you would ask a more reasonable question, or something to that effect. So it is something of a negotiation here, despite the fact they're giving a lot of deference to each other, particularly the king. They're really kind of buttering him up with their language, but basically coming to the point that this is something that not only we can't provide, but there's no one who can provide it. And in fact, this may be your fault, king, because no one has ever asked a problem like this to a wise man or a Chaldean before. This is an unprecedented challenge. And so the king, is the king convinced that he needs to go back to the drawing board and maybe reconsider this? He's intractable. He said what he said, and he means it. And he gives the order that, you know, barring a solution to my query, barring a translation of my dream, that in fact their heads will roll. There will be death and destruction and mayhem dealt out to these wise men. Where is Daniel in this? What's Daniel and his companions? Where are they at this point?
It seems
Cynthia?
like they are not included in that group of the wise men, that they don't know what's going on yet.
Okay, why do you think that they were not included?
Because it seems like they were looking for Daniel and his friends to tell them that the wise men are going to be slain.
Okay, he has to, Leo.
There seems to be a timing issue in terms of when this happened, and they were in training, I think, for roughly 2, maybe even 3 years.
3 years. At the beginning of chapter 1, this training program at Chaldea University of Chaldea, School of Wise Men, then preparation to serve in the king's court was 3 years. And Daniel, in fact, was not among the group that was called in. In fact, he was training. He and the other 3 Hebrews were training for exactly this position, but they were in training. And where Daniel has to hear about this from the captain of the guard. And it's not good news. He's apparently, he and his friends are also going to be included in the cleansing of the court from the false magicians, wizards, and wise men. And so they, in fact, have they through no particular position, no particular mechanism or fault of their own, are included in this group, and their lives are imperiled as well. One of the things, though, that we did find out in the first chapter about Daniel and his companions is that God was watching over them, not just in keeping them looking healthy, but also in helping them to find favor among their peers and among their peers and the supervisors. And it mentions in the first chapter that he gave them not only favor and good health, but also assisted them with their learning. He gave them the ability and amped up, I think, their ability to learn the arts of the Chaldeans and be able to fulfill this particular position. So much so that it said at the end of the training that they stood out among distinction. They were not only better, they were described as being 10 times better than all of the other graduating class that they were among. And so while Daniel is still in training, he's given this particular challenge. And amongst that, also at the end of chapter 1, Daniel was given the ability to understand visions. Didn't say that his companions were, but this is something that the scriptures tell us that God gave to Daniel. I'll suggest to you, perhaps for just such an occasion as this, because the source of this dream is apparently also someone with supernatural abilities. It's not just a wicked imagination that Nebuchadnezzar has, but this is a dream of foretelling. A dream that's going to describe the future. And for Daniel to be among the potential wise men who would advise the king, have the ability to interpret these dreams, would be something to be extremely, well, let's say fortuitous, or maybe even on the verge of being providential. It's certainly a benefit to the king, and as it turns out, to Daniel and his companions here too. So what does the first thing, having heard this news, what does Daniel do in response? Hazel, you? He asked for time. He asked for an audience with the king and asked for time. Now, there is a path. This sounds like it all happens in the afternoon. The king's going to kill him the next day, but the wheels of justice turn somewhat slowly, and this is an administration like anything else. It's difficult to turn even the king's angry proclamations into orders immediately. After all, it's a pretty big deal to go out and destroy his court full of wise men and their families. He's got there's logistics and arrangements to be made and all that sorts of thing. And so Daniel is appealing during this time for God to be able to provide a solution. What his faith is in God, because God is not only the sender but also revealer of dreams. And I don't know that this is his very first time to exercise this ability that God gave to him. I'm suggesting that it's probably not. He probably has exercised it in not situations that were not life and death, but that this was a demonstrated capability. So that's part one, is he asked for time. Jerry, what else?
First thing after he shares the knowledge with his friends, they pray.
That's right. That's the second thing. Is that the first thing on the list after procuring an audience with the king to ask for some time to come up with a solution, is they go to God. And Daniel doesn't go to God. Daniel and his companions go to God. It mentions specifically, so the decree went out and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Daniel goes in and replies, and went in and requested that. And then Daniel returns to his house in verse 17 and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions. So he's still keeping company with at least these four young Hebrew men, and explains the situation to them and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And so it's a personal appeal to God. It's not, this is some great injustice, and God will have to step in and intervene in. But it was a matter about preserving them specifically. And I'm not saying that they were unconcerned about the rest of the families in Babylon, the rest of the wise men's family, or anything like that. But their appeal to God was a personal one. It wasn't for some disjointed, some great injustice that might be played out if God doesn't intervene, but that this particular injustice is going to kill your servants, God. Tim?
It's very telling, I think, that their request to God was one for mercy for their sake. It wasn't asking, well, let me interpret this dream so I can get the reward the king is offering. Exactly. And I don't know that the rewards are really on anybody's mind at this point. The king is always, the favor of the king is not a small thing. It's not something to be trifled with, and it's usually beneficial. But that's not the motivating factor here. People are worried about their lives. And I don't know what the wise men did, but they probably went and did something similar with their pagan gods, or some rituals, or went back to the books and started studying some more to try to find a precedent for this, or something that would help them to be able to respond to the king's demand. But Daniel and his companions prayed to God, and in short order, the mystery was revealed in verse 19, revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. So Daniel, I don't know that he has the exact same dream, but he gets something that enough of an explanation of the dream and its interpretation to be able to go into the king's court. Daniel blessed the God of heaven, and he answered, and he says, I think, to his companions in particular, this great blessing here that begins in verse 20.
And he, what is his reaction in verses 20 through 23? What does he mention specifically? Cynthia.
He mentions that God is in charge of wisdom and power and in control of the government and reveals hidden things.
Reveals hidden things. And not only he sets up and removes kings, he reveals deep knowledge, the knowledge of the deep and hidden things, and knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. He's also the source of might and wisdom. And that they acknowledge in verse 23, to you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. For you have given me wisdom and might, and now you have made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And so it's a very specific giving thanks to God for answering their specific prayer. It wasn't, oh God, spare us this fate, but deliver us, provide us the means, and ultimately as Daniel opens up and praises God here in his prayer, he's intending to give God the credit for this in a very big way, because he recognizes where it came from. It wasn't a good thing for us. Good thing we were bred well, and we've performed and we've done doing so well in school. You know that you've set us up for this honor, and we're ready to receive it, Lord. That's not the kind of prayer it is at all. The prayer is a recognition of God's providential care, of God's might and his wisdom, and his providing for them in this particular case to be able to answer this prayer. Being given the interpretation of the dream, I think Daniel also felt the weight of it, because we know how the story turns out, right? We know what happens over the next 600 years in recorded history, because we're looking back. For everybody else on earth, this is breaking news that can't be overstated. I mean, there's nothing that's been recorded for us anyway, that gives an indication of what's going to happen in the world over the next 600 years like this. I can't think of a single precedent of Old Testament revelation that matches this one. And that's one of the great criticisms of the book of Daniel, is that somebody must have cheated. That in later translations, somebody snuck this stuff in say 200 BC, when most of this stuff most of these events had already occurred, and that's the only way that Daniel could have known that. And for it to be written here at sometime before Daniel's death, say around 530 BC. There's no way that this could be identified. And they're right. Except for God. I mean, the entire stage is set. As incredible it is that these events occurred when they occurred, it's just incredible. It's incredible to us now. There's literally no way for this to have been recorded in Aramaic sometime prior to 500 BC, except for the fact that God intervened and revealed it. There's a sense that if only we had these kind of miracles today, but these are our miracles. These are their miracles, but there are miracles too. The Spirit has preserved them for us so we can be just as amazed, so we can be just as impressed with God's care, his provision, his mercy, and his power, his might, that he knows these things. He knows these things from a unique perspective, being timeless and being almighty. Is not only can he look through history and see what's going to happen, he has the power in the kingdoms of men to make it happen this way. And so he is, in effect, announcing his plans for the world empires. To what end, by the way? Why go to all this trouble? What's in it for God? I mean, that's a very human way of looking at things. I know God's not material, and he doesn't need anything that we've got. But why is God wanting to reveal this in this particular fashion? Chris?
I think at the time, I mean, there are many gods, and the Chaldeans were, when you worship a god that's not a god, then it's making him angry. You should not worship any god before me. And I think it's a lesson, and people today still honor different gods, and it's just.
I think that's a good point. That wasn't the one I was looking for. That's a good point. It's a distinction. It sets God, Jehovah, the God of the land of Judah, the God of Abraham, apart from all the other wannabes, all the other pretenders, all the other fakes. They can't demonstrate this power. Randy?
Well, I was just going to say that it also establishes the purity of his word. So all of these are prophecies, and the prophecies only as good as the establishment of what was supposed to happen. Because if it didn't happen, the prophecy's no good.
That's true.
And if that's no good, then anything else that God said or did could come into question.
That's true. And God says even in Deuteronomy that, the prophets that predict things that don't happen, they don't have to worry about those guys. You have to pay attention to the ones who predict things that happen. They're the ones that say that, in fact, that they're actually getting the word, have supernatural abilities. Is when they predict fantastic things that come about, then they're the ones you need to pay attention to.
And of course, dovetailing into this is the plan of salvation. This was all part of that.
Exactly, and that's where I was really going here. Is this final kingdom?
And we see his son coming in that fourth kingdom, and establishing his kingdom that will last forever.
And again, that's not mentioned in the dream. Okay, it's just not mentioned. Who's the name of the king or anything like that. But it's simply saying these are the events that's going to happen, and it's in the days of this last kingdom, represented by the bottom of the statue, that the stone not carved with hands swings into action and establish a kingdom that fills the earth. And so that's the point of the dream. It's not gold, silver, and bronze. Really, the point of the dream is about God's announcing, and I think for the first time, what his plans are. It's just not clear that Isaiah knew this, or Samuel, or Moses. It's not clear that I don't think that up to this time that God has revealed this even privately to his people in this much detail. Tim?
I think there's several facets of what's going on that we've been talking about. Like Christopher mentioned, I think this is a way that God is showing to Nebuchadnezzar and others that, hey, I'm the real deal. He's also a message to the Hebrews in that, hey, you're in captivity, you're being punished, but I'm still in charge. And then this is a message, this is all part of my plan, even though it looks like my people are done away with, that the nation that was mine is now in captivity. But no, that's not the case. I'm still in charge. Things are still working out the way I want it to. And then it's giving us a glimpse of what's happening in the future. I'm still in control. This is what's going to happen. Rest easy.
And this is very early in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. You remember what's going on back in Judah during this time? Remember, this is after the first captivity. And no numbers are given that I know of about the numbers of people who are taken in this particular captivity. So there's actually a descendant of David sitting on the throne in Judah. Life is carrying on in some measure as it had been before. Sure, they were vassals to the king of Babylon, and they weren't happy about it. They were thinking they were making plans to rebel, and all the subsequent events that go along with Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is still standing. There's still a temple standing. It's been robbed of some of its treats, some of its valuables, but the temple is still there, and the priests are still there, and a son of David is still on the throne in Jerusalem. And so all this is, they're not getting this message at the same time that Nebuchadnezzar is, but this is also for the benefit of those people and their descendants as well. Gary?
Two things that amazed me. Nebuchadnezzar kept his mouth shut all the time that Daniel was speaking. I see no response from him. And then in verse 46, he fell on his face.
Right.
That is amazing to me.
Well, the king in verse 26 declared to Daniel, "Are you able to make known to me the dream that I've seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answers the king, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king this mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these, and he goes to describe the dream. And so he begins initially with putting all the credit to God. He says, no one is able to do this but God. He agrees with the assessment of the wise men initially. No one is able to do this but God. And Daniel says, I'm here on behalf of God who has revealed it to me. Clint?
But he doesn't just do what the king asked, right? The king's command was, tell me the dream and tell me the interpretation. But the very next verse where you stopped, Daniel says, now you were on your bed and you were thinking about what was going to come. So God took it one step further and said, I can not only tell you about your dream, I can tell you what you were thinking the night before you fell asleep.
Right. And the occasion is wasn't just that God has this idea of just going to drop this on Nebuchadnezzar and see what happens. But since Nebuchadnezzar was already thinking about what's going to come, God intervenes and demonstrates his power. Christopher?
I just want to follow up with verse 47, where it says, truly your God is the God of the Lord of Kings and revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. He is so impressed, and I just love how he,
Absolutely. It's interesting. It's really, really having to be, he's having to measure his response by the edict that he made. It's the problem has been framed in such a way that this is the only thing that you could say. You couldn't just say, well, that's pretty good. That's nice, but I've seen better. He's literally, it's been put at such high accolades, and the stakes are so high that the king's response here is about the only natural one, the only reasonable one. He could intervene with his ego and say something shameful and self-centered and try to deflect from it, but he is truly awed by God's demonstration of power through Daniel. And we'll touch on that, just how awed he is a little later on. He goes in to describe then what this image is, and this image is described beginning in verse 31. And it's and again, I like verse 30. Whereas for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. That God is blessing everybody in the court who hears this by being able not only to reveal the future, but also in being able to give comfort to the king and tell the king his own thoughts. Which again, that's, the Chaldeans, as wizards and wise men, said no one can do that. And no one has ever asked anyone to ever do something like that. Only a God can do this. And in fact, God says, I'll accept the challenge. And I will deliver exactly what it is that you said that no one else could provide but a God. And being a God, I can do that. And Daniel frames that here. He says, it's not just me. It's not just because I'm so smart I figured it out, but God has revealed it to me. Now, what's the dream? What happens in the dream? Who wants to describe that? Joe, surely you've got it on your mind.
Well, there is a statue, and it's a historical narrative of what's to come. The head of gold is Babylon. After that, the Medes and Persians will arise, being the chest of silver. Post that kingdom, there's a rise of the Grecian kingdom, and then post Alexander the Great, there's a series of conflicts which lead to the rise of the Roman Empire, being the iron and clay mix, and the amazing layout of it doesn't just provide a very broad overview. It provides a lot of detail in that with not only the components of the statue representing actual historical events, but then which leads finally to when we know the Romans were in power, Christ was born.
And even the materials, okay, that of the statue are reflective in that. But that's the dream of the image. What happens? What's the action in the dream?
It's crushed.
It's crushed by what?
By the kingdom, the one true kingdom.
By the rock not carved with hands. Was the dream over them? No. What happens to the rock?
Fills the earth.
It grows into a mountain that fills the earth.
Fills the whole earth.
Fills the whole earth. And so, like this interpretation is like the parables. It's not, and it's not a pure allegory, but you have to pay attention to the action. The statue is just there. It's not moving and threatening, and it's not doing anything until this rock comes out of nowhere and destroys the statue and displaces it completely over the rubble by becoming this giant mountain that fills the earth. And what's telling us here, this is something about the materials, and not only visually distinctive, and they're different types of materials in terms of their strength, in terms of their value, in terms of how scarce they are. I mean, gold and silver are worthy to have, but they aren't very strong compared to bronze. Bronze is a lot more. I mean, if you want stuff to last, you would make it out of bronze. It's not as soft. It's not as easily damaged. But even better than bronze is iron. Iron is strong. Iron, in terms of strength and the representation of what we recognize in history of the spread of influence, how powerful these empires were, that in fact Babylon was a powerful empire, but the Medes and Persians actually controlled more territory and had bigger, more formidable armies than Babylon did. And the Greeks, they subdued everybody in the Mediterranean. So far with Babylonia, we're talking about this Middle East area as being the kingdom. With the Medes and the Persians, it extends all of that area, plus much further to the east. With the Mediterraneans, it went all the way to the east, but it went all the way around the Mediterranean. The Greeks conquered all the nations except for the extreme west of the Mediterranean and subdued them. And then, as Joe said, there were a lot of conflicts in between about just exactly who was in power, but the next world kingdom, the next unified world kingdom, was that of Rome. And Rome was an extremely powerful kingdom that controlled all of the area that was being talked about. And it's not geography doesn't come up in this, but we know through history the power of the Roman Empire. And one of the powers was, of course, in its government and its armies. But it also had this technique where it assimilated a lot of cultures. And if they behaved themselves and acceded that Rome was in charge, it kind of let them continue doing whatever they were doing. And that helped that empire to be able to grow, and thus this mingled clay. And kingdoms that were of an inferior material were nonetheless coexisting and mingled in with the extremely strong material, and it's in the days of that situation, not the rising of power of Rome, not the expansion and subduing of all these other nations. It's in this assimilation period in which there's the iron there, and the iron is dominant, but there's also some inferior, some clay mingling in with it as well, that is not as strong as what the iron represented. It's in the days of this kingdom that God's kingdom be established. Now again, we know the rest of the story. We look back and we recognize this. And we say, yeah, this is important, this is neat how it's kind of cool the way this is spread, this is explained this way. But this is the first time that anybody is hearing this, that I can tell. This is news. This is breaking news. And to people who were students of God and thinking about the promises of God, and even now, if you're thinking some about the restoration, the coming of the kingdom of God as being the restoration of the Solomon's empire. How does Solomon's empire compare to the end result in his vision? It's small. God's plans are so much bigger than the land between the Euphrates and the Nile. The land that was considered the homeland of Abraham's descendants. His plans are so much bigger than that. It's the whole world. And it's true that Solomon's, I think, empire, when Solomon was king, he could be considered a world power in terms of the amount of territory that one person or one family controlled. But the known world was quite a bit smaller than that in that time. The kingdom that God describes here in this dream, the world isn't big enough to contain it. Rather the other way around. It contains the world. The establishment of God's kingdom is going to be way different than these empires. Not only in the material, but also in its duration. And God is revealing this for the first time in a pagan court. And it's being revealed through God. Very clearly, Daniel and his friends made their appeal to God, and God delivered, and Daniel very clearly gives all the credit for this to God as he begins to enter this explanation. And this very orderly explanation about what's going to happen, about the order of materials. Again, nobody on earth knows this. Nobody. And matter of fact, the majority of earth, the majority of people living, wouldn't be aware of this for centuries. Not even the Romans. The Romans wouldn't be able to recognize, hey, it's our turn, we're the iron. Clear the way, here comes the iron. Nobody could do that. But these few people who were able and had access to Daniel's book and to understand the dream and its interpretation. This is all amazing stuff. Really amazing stuff. And again, we think if only we had miracles today, what good we'd be able to do. This is our miracles. This is the stuff that people that want to see a sign, this is what we need to go to. This is here for that. And this is no less impressive. I mean, you think, oh yeah, to those primitives in 600 BC, this would knock their socks off. That'd be pretty impressive, that. But we've seen Steven Spielberg. We were a lot harder to convince with being impressed. I'm not. I'm knocked over by this. This is amazing and unprecedented. And here, this simple little story that we learned maybe as little tykes, maybe in our first Bible story book that our parents maybe read to us or something like that. This story is contained and told in that particular context, not in the gory detail that we're going into here, but you think it's just a neat story. But it's way more than a neat story. This is God's flex. This is God demonstrating his power. And his plan, announcing his plans in a pagan court. That's just amazing. The folks in the court were also pretty amazed. What was the result after Daniel told the dream and the interpretation? Cynthia?
Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and said, God is the God of gods and Lord of kings and revealer of mysteries. And he promoted Daniel over the province of Babylon and head over all the wise men.
Okay. And this is Daniel's he's still got to go back to school, as far as I understand, because it is mentioned in the first chapter about these 4 young men being evaluated at the end of their period. But Daniel's future has been laid out here. And the king doesn't wait until graduation. He begins pays honor and homage to Daniel in verse 46 right then, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him, which I suspect that Daniel went to some measure to try to refuse. Yes, or at least tried to frame it and say, you're really worshiping God, not me. Cynthia?
Another way that these prophecies are important to us is to teach us or remind us that governments are not permanent things, and that whatever government happens to be going on is going to change, and nations are going to have conflicts, and it's just the way of the world, and God is still in control, and that's what we need to pay attention to, is not all the politics and what countries mad at what other countries.
That's an excellent point. And I think up to this point, I'm not sure that anybody had a worldview that was like this one, of where there was a deity that was in power. It was usually whoever was the conqueror is their deity that had the upper hand. You remember the Assyrians, they came in and said, well, these guys their gods must be the gods of the mountain or the gods of the plains, or that there is it's a temper. They're changing places just like the world governments are. I don't know that there's another instance in history of an explanation of world history being laid out as being under the control of a single deity like this. Tom?
But I would make this observation. Daniel was involved in their politics.
That's true. And he's now not just a rising student, not just among the, vying for being valedictorian of his class, perhaps, but he's also got the attention of the court and has been identified as being a ruler. And he goes on to bring his companions in, and they're set as reporting to him as well. So they're already, their future, as far as what their future in the court is already being described here. And so God is continuing to take care of them. But again, this is so impressive because Nebuchadnezzar is overwhelmed. He offers the only natural response. Well, he could have done like Pharaoh and hardened his heart and not conceded any credit, but he's a thinking, compassionate, honest man enough to be able to recognize of who God is and this demonstration of power. Pretty amazing. Now, we looked at a verse last week about God calling Nebuchadnezzar my servant. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't know that yet, but he's gotten his first glimpse in this. Thank you for all your participation.